Arrest him. He doesn't belong anywhere near that car. The words cut clean through the warm California afternoon, sharp enough to turn heads before the sirens even finished rising in the distance. A few people near the glass-front Rolls-Royce showroom paused mid-step, their reflections caught in the polished chrome like frozen witnesses. Marcus Reed didn't move. He stood beside the car, one hand resting lightly on the cool metal of the door, as if confirming something real beneath his fingertips. The sunlight slid across the hood, catching the spirit of ecstasy and scattering light into his eyes, but he didn't blink. Across from him, Victoria Hale adjusted her sunglasses with slow precision, her posture straight, her expression untouched by doubt. Everything about her was deliberate. Her white tailored suit, the measured tilt of her chin, the way her voice carried without needing to rise. She didn't shout. She didn't need to. I saw him, she continued, gesturing toward Marcus as if presenting evidence already decided. He was lingering, watching. Now he's touching the vehicle. A quiet murmur rippled through the small gathering crowd, subtle but present, like a current just beneath the surface. Phones began to lift, not aggressively, just enough to capture. Marcus exhaled slowly, the breath barely visible, more felt than seen. His shirt was simple, sleeves rolled just below the elbows, fabric softened by years of wear. There was nothing about him that matched the gleaming car beside him, at least not to the eyes that skimmed surfaces and stopped there. A police cruiser rolled to a stop at the curb, tires pressing softly against the asphalt, and for a moment the entire scene seemed to hold its breath. One officer stepped out, scanning quickly, eyes moving from Victoria to Marcus, then to the car itself. "Sir," the officer said, calm but firm, "I'm going to need you to step away from the vehicle." Marcus turned his head slightly, just enough to meet the officer's gaze. His expression wasn't defensive. It wasn't afraid. It was steady, like someone who had seen this moment before in different forms, under different lights. "Is there a problem?" he asked, his voice even, grounded, carrying just far enough to be heard without forcing attention. Victoria let out a small, controlled breath, almost a laugh, but not quite. "The problem," she said, "is that this man is attempting to access a vehicle that doesn't belong to him." The officer nodded once, shifting his stance, hand resting near his belt, not threatening, just procedural. "Sir, I'll need you to keep your hands where I can see them." Marcus slowly lifted his hand from the car, the absence of contact leaving the metal surface gleaming and untouched behind him. The reflection in the door caught his image, slightly distorted, stretched along the curve of the frame, a man made unfamiliar by the angle of someone else's perspective. Around him, the air felt thinner, tighter, filled with unspoken conclusions forming faster than facts. Victoria took a step closer, heels clicking softly against the pavement, each step measured, controlled. "People like him think they can just walk up, act confident, and no one will question it," she said, not directly to the officer, not directly to Marcus, but to the space between them where judgment lived. Marcus's eyes shifted briefly, not to her face, but to the reflection of her standing beside him in the car door. Two figures framed in the same surface, separated not by distance, but by assumption. He inhaled once, slow and deliberate, the kind of breath that settles something deeper than nerves. The siren had faded. The street noise had softened. Even the crowd seemed quieter now, as if waiting for something to tip the balance one way or the other. Marcus lowered his gaze for just a second, then looked back up, not at the officer this time, but straight ahead, beyond the glass, beyond the reflections, as if seeing something none of them could. And still, he didn't step back. The officer's radio crackled softly at his shoulder, a low static hum that seemed louder in the quiet that had settled over the sidewalk. And Marcus kept his hands visible, relaxed at chest level, fingers slightly apart, not stiff, not defensive, just present, as if he understood the choreography of moments like this better than anyone else standing there. The officer took a step closer, careful, measured, his eyes narrowing just enough to study Marcus more closely, not the clothes, not the surface, but the stillness, the absence of panic, something that did not quite align with the accusation hanging in the air. "Do you have identification on you, sir?" the officer asked, his tone even, procedural, but carrying the weight of expectation, and Marcus nodded once, slow, deliberate, before reaching into the inside pocket of his shirt, pausing just long enough for the officer to register the movement, then pulling out a slim leather wallet, worn at the edges but clean, and holding it out without stepping forward. Victoria shifted her weight slightly, her heel turning a fraction on the pavement, impatience flickering across her face like a shadow that refused to stay hidden, and she folded her arms, watching with the quiet certainty of someone who had already decided how this would end. A second patrol car rolled up behind the first, not urgent, just reinforcing presence, and two more officers stepped out, their radios murmuring, their eyes scanning, taking in the crowd, the car, the man, the woman, assembling a picture from fragments. Marcus opened the wallet slowly, revealing a driver's license and a card tucked behind it, the officer leaning in just enough to read, his brow tightening for a brief second. Not confusion, not yet recognition, but something closer to hesitation, like a thought forming that did not quite fit the situation. Marcus read. The officer read quietly, glancing up, then back down, his thumb brushing the edge of the second card, the one with a subtle metallic sheen that caught the sunlight differently than the rest, and Marcus noticed the pause, the almost imperceptible shift in the officer's breathing. Behind them, someone in the crowd whispered, the sound thin but sharp, and a phone camera adjusted focus, capturing the moment where certainty began to blur. Victoria took a small step forward, her voice smooth, controlled, but edged now with something firmer, something that wanted resolution. Officer, I do not see why we are still verifying anything. The dealership staff can confirm he does not work here, and he certainly is not a client, she said, her gaze never leaving Marcus, as if willing him to break, to slip, to reveal something that would justify the scene she had already constructed. Marcus closed the wallet halfway, not rushing, not resisting, just allowing the moment to stretch, and his eyes moved briefly to the reflection in the car door again, catching the alignment of uniforms, polished shoes, pressed fabric, and then his own image, steady, unchanged. The officer straightened slightly, handing the wallet back, but not fully releasing it yet, his fingers lingering for a fraction of a second, as if weighing something unseen, then finally letting go. Sir, can you explain why you are here and your connection to this vehicle? He asked, and the question hung in the air, heavier now, no longer just procedure but a turning point. Marcus took the wallet, slid it back into his pocket with the same measured care, and then let his hands fall naturally to his sides, the tension in the space shifting, subtle but undeniable, like the air before a storm changes direction. He looked at the officer, then past him, briefly, toward the glass showroom where a salesman had stopped mid-step inside, watching through the transparent wall, frozen between curiosity and hesitation. Marcus's voice, when it came, was quiet, but it carried, not because it was loud, but because everything else had gone still enough to make room for it. I am here because this car is scheduled for delivery today, he said, each word placed carefully, not rushed, not defensive. And the officer's expression flickered again, uncertainty now more visible, the edges of the situation beginning to loosen. Victoria's lips parted slightly, a breath drawn in, not yet disbelief, but the first crack in certainty, and the sunlight shifted again across the hood of the car, the reflection sharpening, revealing not just surfaces, but the tension beneath them, waiting to be understood. The words settled into the space with a quiet weight, and for a moment no one moved, not the officers, not the small crowd gathered along the curb, not even Victoria, whose posture remained upright, but no longer as certain as before. The officer closest to Marcus shifted his stance slightly, the subtle scrape of his shoe against the pavement sounding louder than it should have, and he glanced toward the showroom, where the salesman inside hesitated, one hand hovering near the door handle as if unsure whether to step out or remain behind the glass. Scheduled delivery? The officer repeated, his voice lower now, less commanding, more searching, as if testing the shape of the explanation against what he had been told just minutes earlier. Marcus nodded once, his gaze steady, not challenging, not pleading, simply present, and the sunlight continued to reflect off the car's polished surface, throwing fragments of brightness across his face and the officer's uniform, softening the sharp lines of the moment without removing the tension beneath it. Victoria let out a controlled breath, the kind that carried both disbelief and irritation, and she took another step forward, closing the distance just enough to reassert herself in the space, her heels tapping lightly against the concrete in a rhythm that felt deliberate, almost rehearsed. "That is not possible," she said, her tone measured but firmer now, as if certainty could be restored through insistence. "I have been working with this dealership for years. I would know if there were a delivery of that level, and I would certainly know the client." And her eyes flicked briefly toward the salesman inside, as if expecting confirmation to arrive without question. The second officer, who had been standing slightly behind, stepped closer, his attention now fully engaged, and he looked from Marcus to Victoria and back again, the narrative no longer as clear as it had seemed when the call came through. Marcus did not respond immediately, and that pause stretched just long enough to draw focus, to pull attention inward, like the moment before a curtain lifts. He turned his head slightly toward the showroom, his eyes settling on the salesman, who finally pushed the door open. The soft click of the handle cutting through the quiet, and the man stepped outside, adjusting his tie, his expression caught somewhere between professional composure and visible uncertainty. "Sir," the salesman said, directing his voice toward Marcus first, not loudly, but clearly enough to be heard by those closest. And that single choice of direction shifted something subtle in the air, a realignment of attention that did not go unnoticed. Victoria's posture stiffened, her shoulders drawing back just a fraction, as if resisting that shift, and she crossed her arms more tightly, her sunglasses reflecting the scene back at her in fragmented pieces. The officer closest to Marcus glanced at the salesman, then back at Marcus, and then at the car, as if recalibrating the sequence of events in his mind. "Do you know this individual?" the officer asked, his tone now balanced between both sides, no longer anchored in assumption. The salesman hesitated, just for a second, and in that second the entire scene seemed to lean forward, waiting, listening, the quiet hum of the street returning in faint layers, a passing car in the distance, the soft rustle of someone shifting their weight in the crowd. Marcus remained still, his hands relaxed at his sides, his expression unchanged, but his presence now carried something different, not louder, not more forceful, but more defined, as if the outline of who he was had begun to come into focus beyond the surface. Victoria's jaw tightened slightly, the movement small but visible, and she spoke again, quicker this time, the edges of her control beginning to show. "This is unnecessary. We are wasting time. The situation is clear," she said, though her voice no longer carried the same effortless certainty it had at the beginning. The officer did not respond immediately, his attention still on the salesman, waiting for an answer that now seemed to hold more weight than anyone expected. The sunlight shifted once more across the car's hood, the reflection sharpening, and in that reflection the figures stood closer now, not physically, but in consequence, the distance between assumption and truth, narrowing with each passing second, and Marcus, without raising his voice, without changing his posture, stood at the center of it, steady as the moment continued to unfold. The salesman's hesitation broke in a quiet exhale, and he stepped fully onto the sidewalk, the glass door closing softly behind him with a muted click that sounded far louder than it should have, and his eyes moved first to Marcus, then briefly to the officers, before settling somewhere between professionalism and recognition. "Yes, officer," he said carefully, his voice steady but carrying a trace of caution. "He is expected today." And the words did not land all at once, they unfolded slowly, like a curtain being drawn back inch by inch. The officer's posture shifted again, the tension in his shoulders easing just slightly, and he turned his head toward Victoria, not abruptly, but with enough intention to acknowledge that the situation was no longer one-sided. Victoria blinked once behind her sunglasses, the movement small but telling, and her lips parted as if to respond, but no immediate words followed, only a brief silence that felt heavier than anything said so far. "Expected?" she repeated finally, her voice still controlled, but now edged with something sharper, something that reached for certainty that was beginning to slip. Expected in what capacity? And the question hung in the air, not just directed at the salesman, but at the entire scene that was quietly rearranging itself. The salesman adjusted his tie again, a reflex more than a necessity, and glanced once toward Marcus. as if seeking permission. Without asking for it, then back to the officer. "He is the client for this vehicle," he said, each word measured, deliberate, leaving no room for misinterpretation, and the reflection on the car door caught the moment, capturing Victoria's stillness, the officer's recalibration, and Marcus's unchanged posture all in one frame. A faint murmur moved through the small crowd again, softer this time, less certain, as if the narrative they had been building in their minds was beginning to unravel. The second officer shifted his weight, his radio brushing lightly against his shoulder, and he glanced at his partner, a silent exchange passing between them, subtle but clear, the kind that comes when a situation no longer aligns with its original call. Marcus remained still, his gaze steady, not fixed on any one person now, but open, as if allowing the moment to come to him rather than chasing it. Victoria took a small step back, almost imperceptible, her heel catching slightly on a seam in the pavement before settling again, and her arms loosened just a fraction, though she quickly recrossed them, reassembling her composure piece by piece. "There must be some confusion," she said, her voice quieter now, not weaker, but more contained, as if recalibrating rather than retreating. "I have not been informed of any such transaction." And the statement felt less like a declaration and more like a question she was not ready to ask directly. The officer nearest Marcus nodded once, slow, absorbing the shift, and then addressed the salesman again. "Can you verify that clearly?" he asked, his tone now procedural in a different way, not enforcing, but confirming. The salesman straightened slightly, the hesitation in his posture giving way to something more certain. "Yes, officer," he said. "The purchase was finalized through a private acquisition channel earlier this week, and today is the scheduled delivery." And as he spoke, the pieces of the moment seemed to settle into place. Not abruptly, but with a quiet inevitability. The sunlight moved again across the car's surface, the reflection sharpening, and in that reflection Marcus stood unchanged, steady and grounded, while around him the assumptions that had shaped the last few minutes began to dissolve. Victoria's jaw tightened again, but this time it held, not with confidence, but with restraint, and her gaze shifted, not directly at Marcus, but toward the car, toward the emblem, toward something that no longer felt as simple as it had moments before. The officer exhaled softly, the tension in his stance easing as he took a half step back, the space between him and Marcus widening just enough to signal a change, and the air itself seemed to loosen, the weight lifting slightly though not completely gone. And Marcus, without moving forward, without asserting anything more than his presence, remained exactly where he had been from the beginning, steady at the center of a moment. That was no longer what it had seemed. The shift in the air did not erase what had already been set in motion. It only changed its direction, and the officers remained where they were for a moment longer, as if allowing the truth to fully settle before stepping away from the shape of the accusation that had brought them there. The lead officer cleared his throat softly, the sound subtle but enough to draw attention back to procedure, and he adjusted his stance, no longer positioned as a barrier, but as a presence reassessing the situation. "All right," he said, his tone measured, calm, but now carrying a different weight. "It looks like there has been a misunderstanding." And the word misunderstanding lingered, not dismissing what had happened, but reframing it in a way that felt almost too small for the tension that had filled the last few minutes. Marcus did not respond, his posture unchanged, his hands resting naturally at his sides, but his eyes moved briefly toward the officers, acknowledging the shift without claiming it. Victoria's expression tightened again, not with the same certainty as before, but with something more complex, a mix of resistance and recalibration, and she lowered her sunglasses just slightly, enough for her eyes to be visible now, scanning Marcus more carefully than before, as if seeing him for the first time rather than the version she had assumed. "Misunderstanding," she repeated, quieter now, the word catching slightly as if it did not fit comfortably in her mouth, and she let out a slow breath, her shoulders rising and falling in a controlled motion. "I acted on what I observed," she added, her tone returning to its structured composure, though the edges were no longer as sharp. The second officer nodded once, acknowledging her statement without reinforcing it, and he glanced toward Marcus again, his gaze steadier now, less guarded. "Sir, we appreciate your cooperation," he said, and the phrasing was simple, but it marked a clear transition. The authority in his voice no longer directed at Marcus, but aligned with him. Marcus gave a small nod in return, the movement minimal, almost invisible unless one was watching closely, and his attention shifted briefly to the car again, the smooth curve of the door, the reflection of light sliding across its surface, unchanged by everything that had just unfolded around it. The salesman stepped slightly closer to Marcus, careful not to intrude, and spoke in a lower tone, professional but respectful. "We have everything prepared inside whenever you are ready," he said, and the invitation was subtle, but it carried an entirely different energy than the moment before, one of recognition rather than suspicion. Victoria remained where she was, her arms no longer crossed, her hands now resting at her sides, fingers lightly brushing the fabric of her jacket as if grounding herself, and her gaze followed the exchange between Marcus and the salesman, something in her expression shifting again, not yet understanding, but no longer certain of her place in the situation. The crowd that had gathered began to loosen, some lowering their phones, others stepping back, the quiet hum of normal life beginning to return in fragments, the distant sound of traffic, the soft murmur of conversation. But the space around Marcus and Victoria remained still, as if the moment had not fully released them yet. The officer took a step back toward his vehicle, his partner following, the presence of authority receding not abruptly, but with a measured withdrawal, leaving behind a space that now felt different, lighter, but also more exposed. Victoria inhaled slowly, her gaze still fixed on Marcus, and for the first time since she had spoken, there was hesitation in her expression, not loud, not obvious, but present, like a crack in glass that only revealed itself when the light hit it at the right angle. Marcus turned slightly toward the showroom, the movement calm, unhurried, as if the next step had always been clear to him, and the sunlight caught his face again, not harsh, not blinding, just steady, illuminating the same quiet composure that had carried him through the entire moment. And as he took a step forward, not away, not in retreat, but toward the glass doors, the distance between what had been assumed and what was real became impossible to ignore, hanging in the air behind him, silent, undeniable, and unresolved for those who had not yet understood it. The glass door opened with a soft, controlled motion, and Marcus stepped inside without looking back, the shift from sunlight to the cooler interior light smoothing the edges of the moment, as if the world itself had lowered its voice. The showroom air carried a faint scent of polished leather and clean metal, quiet and deliberate, a space where everything was designed to reflect precision and value. And yet the weight of what had just happened lingered behind him like a shadow that had not fully detached. The salesman moved beside him, not ahead, not behind, but aligned, his posture subtly adjusted, his tone respectful without being exaggerated. "We have the documents ready in the office," he said, gesturing toward a glass-walled room at the far end, where a table sat prepared, folders arranged with exact spacing, as if order itself could restore balance. Marcus nodded once, his steps measured across the polished floor, the sound of his shoes muted against the surface, each movement steady, unhurried, as though time had shifted to match his pace. Outside, through the transparent wall, Victoria remained where she stood, her figure framed by the reflection of the car and the fading presence of the police vehicles. And for a moment she did not move, her gaze fixed on the space Marcus had just occupied, as if trying to reconcile what she had seen with what she believed. Her hand lifted slowly to adjust her sunglasses again, but this time she did not raise them back into place, instead holding them loosely between her fingers, the barrier they provided no longer necessary, or perhaps no longer effective. The street sounds returned in layers, distant engines, footsteps, a voice calling from across the sidewalk. But around her there was a pocket of stillness, a quiet that did not come from absence, but from realization beginning to take shape. Inside, Marcus paused briefly near the office doorway, his reflection caught again in the glass, but now clearer, no longer distorted by curvature, and for a moment he looked at it, not with pride, not with satisfaction, but with a calm recognition, as if confirming something that had never required proof. The salesman opened the door for him, stepping aside, and Marcus entered, the room smaller, more contained, the outside world now softened behind glass. A folder lay open on the table, pages aligned, a pen resting precisely at the edge, waiting, and the sunlight filtered through the window, casting a gentle line across the surface, dividing light and shadow without conflict. Marcus placed his hand lightly on the table, feeling the smooth finish beneath his palm, grounding himself not in the moment that had just passed, but in the one that was now present. Outside, Victoria took a step forward, then another, slower this time, her movement no longer driven by certainty, but by something quieter, something searching, and she stopped just short of the showroom entrance, her reflection merging with the glass, her image layered over the interior scene where Marcus now stood. Her eyes followed him through the glass, no longer sharp, no longer dismissive, but focused, attentive, as if trying to understand not just what had happened, but why she had seen it the way she did. The officers had returned to their vehicles, their presence now distant, the urgency gone, replaced by routine, and the small crowd had dispersed, leaving only fragments of the moment behind, echoes that would fade but not entirely disappear. Inside the office, Marcus picked up the pen, not quickly, not ceremonially, just naturally, and the movement was simple, almost ordinary, yet it carried the quiet weight of everything that had unfolded outside and beyond the glass. Victoria stood in the reflection of that action, her posture no longer defined by control, but by stillness, as if for the first time, she was not directing the moment, but witnessing it. And in that stillness, something unspoken settled, not loud, not dramatic, but undeniable, like a truth that does not need to be announced to be felt. The pen touched the paper with a quiet finality, and the soft scratch of ink against the page seemed louder than the earlier sirens, louder than the murmurs, louder than the certainty that had once filled the sidewalk outside. And Marcus signed his name in one smooth motion, not rushed, not emphasized, just complete, as if the act itself did not need validation because it had already been earned long before this moment. The salesman watched closely, his posture straight but respectful, and when Marcus finished, he gently turned the folder, aligning the documents with practiced precision, his movements careful, almost reverent now, as though aware that what he was witnessing carried more than just a transaction. Outside, Victoria stepped closer to the glass, the distance between her and the interior narrowing to only a few inches of transparent barrier, and her reflection overlapped with Marcus's form inside. Their images layered together in a way that felt almost symbolic, though neither of them acknowledged it directly. Her eyes followed the motion of the pen, the subtle lift of Marcus's hand as he set it down, and something in her expression shifted again, not sharply, but deeply, like a realization settling beneath the surface where it could not be easily dismissed. Inside, the salesman spoke quietly. "Everything is finalized, Mr. Reed," and the use of his name carried a different weight now, not just identification, but recognition, the kind that acknowledges position without needing to declare it. Marcus nodded once, his gaze steady, and reached for the key fob resting on the table, its polished surface catching the light as he picked it up, the small metallic click echoing softly in the room as he turned it in his hand. For a brief moment, he paused, not because he needed to, but because the moment itself seemed to ask for it, the stillness returning, quieter now, more contained, like the aftermath of something that had shifted but not yet fully settled. Outside, Victoria lowered her sunglasses completely, holding them at her side, and her eyes remained fixed on Marcus, no longer searching for confirmation of what she believed, but trying to understand what she had missed. Her breathing slowed, visible only in the slight rise and fall of her shoulders, and she took one final step forward until she stood directly in front of the glass door. Marcus turned slightly toward the exit, the key fob now resting naturally in his hand, and as he moved, his reflection aligned again with Victoria's, the two images meeting at the surface of the glass, separated by nothing more than a thin boundary that suddenly felt heavier than it looked. He pushed the door open, the motion smooth, unforced, and stepped outside, the sunlight returning, wrapping around him in a way that felt unchanged by everything that had come before. Victoria did not move at first, her gaze lifting to meet his fully now, no longer filtered through assumption, no longer shielded by distance. And for a moment neither of them spoke, the silence stretching, not empty, but full of everything that had led to this point. Marcus looked at her, not with accusation, not with triumph, but with a calm clarity that left no room for misunderstanding. And when he spoke, his voice was quiet, steady, carrying only as far as it needed to. "You did not ask," he said, the words simple, but precise, and they settled into the space between them with a weight that did not require repetition. Victoria's lips parted slightly, a response forming but not yet finding its shape, and her eyes flickered, not away, but inward, as if the realization was no longer about him, but about herself. Marcus held her gaze for just a moment longer, then stepped past her, the distance between them closing and then opening again in a single fluid motion. And the sound of his footsteps on the pavement was soft, steady, fading into the rhythm of the street as he walked toward the car that had never been out of place. Behind him, Victoria remained still, her reflection now alone in the glass, the space beside her empty, but filled with something she could no longer ignore, something that had shifted not around her, but within her, quiet, undeniable, and irreversible. The door closed softly behind Marcus, the sound barely noticeable against the quiet rhythm of the street, and he walked toward the car with the same measured pace, each step grounded, unhurried, as if nothing about the last few minutes had the power to alter the direction he was already moving in. The sunlight rested across the hood, steady and bright, and when he reached the driver's side, he paused just long enough to let his hand hover above the surface, not in hesitation, but in recognition of a moment that had already passed. And then he pressed the key fob once, the subtle click unlocking the car with a quiet authority that needed no audience. Behind him, Victoria finally moved, one step forward, then another, her heels no longer striking the pavement with the same sharp confidence, but softer now, as if each step carried thought instead of certainty, and she stopped a few feet behind him, close enough to speak, far enough to feel the distance that had formed between who she was and what she had just done. "Mr. Reed," she said, her voice controlled but lower, stripped of its earlier edge, and the name lingered differently this time, no longer an assumption, but an acknowledgement. Marcus did not turn immediately, his gaze resting on the car's reflection, where both of them appeared again, side by side, but no longer equal in posture, and after a brief moment, he turned slightly, just enough to face her without fully closing the space. Victoria took a breath, her fingers tightening briefly around the sunglasses she still held, and her eyes met his directly, no shield, no distance. "I made a mistake," she said, the words simple, but not easy, and they settled between them without defense, without qualification. The street seemed to quiet again, not completely, but enough for the moment to stand on its own, and Marcus watched her, not with judgment, not with relief, but with a calm that did not shift in response to her words. "I acted too quickly," she continued, her voice steady but softer now. "I saw something, and I decided what it meant before I understood it." And there was no performance in her tone, no attempt to regain control, only a recognition that had arrived too late to prevent what had already happened. Marcus listened, his expression unchanged, and the sunlight moved slightly across his face, softening the lines without altering the steadiness beneath them. Victoria exhaled slowly, the tension in her shoulders easing just a fraction. "I should not have called them," she added, the admission quiet, almost restrained, as if saying it too loudly would make it heavier than she could carry. Marcus nodded once, the movement small, acknowledging the words without absorbing them, and he shifted his weight slightly, his hand resting lightly on the car door, the metal cool beneath his palm. "You saw what you expected to see," he said finally, his voice even, not accusatory, not forgiving, simply stating what had already become clear, and the words did not rise. They settled, like something that had always been there waiting to be spoken. Victoria's gaze lowered for a brief moment, not in avoidance, but in reflection, and when she looked back up, there was a quiet understanding in her eyes that had not been there before, something less certain, but more honest. "That is not who I want to be," she said, and the sentence was not directed at him alone, but at herself, at the space between who she believed she was and what her actions had revealed. Marcus studied her for a moment, not long, just enough to see the shift, and then he opened the car door, the movement smooth, unhurried, and the interior caught the light. Leather and chrome reflecting a quiet elegance untouched by everything that had unfolded outside. Victoria remained where she stood, not stepping closer, not reaching for anything more, her hands now still at her sides, the sunglasses hanging loosely from her fingers. And as Marcus prepared to step in, she spoke once more, softer now, almost carried by the air itself. "I am sorry." And the words were not repeated, not emphasized, just released. Marcus paused for a fraction of a second, not turning back, not responding with words, but with a stillness that acknowledged the moment without needing to define it. And then he stepped into the car, the door closing gently behind him, leaving Victoria standing in the quiet space between what had happened and what she would carry from it. The sunlight still falling across the pavement, unchanged, steady, and indifferent to everything except the truth that now remained. The engine started with a low, controlled hum, smooth and precise. And for a moment Marcus remained still behind the wheel, his hands resting lightly on it. Not gripping, not claiming, just present, as if allowing the moment to settle before it moved forward. The interior of the car was quiet, insulated from the outside world, the soft leather beneath him carrying a subtle warmth from the afternoon sun. And the faint reflection of the showroom glass lingered across the windshield, layering the outside and inside together in a single frame. Beyond the glass, Victoria stood where she had stopped, her figure no longer rigid, no longer defined by control, but by stillness, and the space around her felt wider now, not because anything had changed physically, but because something within her had shifted, leaving room for a different kind of awareness. Marcus exhaled slowly, the breath steady, and his eyes moved forward, not back, not toward what had happened, but toward the road ahead, where the light stretched across the pavement in long, even lines. He adjusted his hand slightly on the wheel. A small movement, almost invisible, and then eased the car forward, the motion smooth, silent, the tires rolling over the pavement without resistance. Outside, Victoria watched as the car moved past her, not fast, not slow, just steady, and her reflection followed it briefly in the glass of the showroom before fading, leaving her standing alone in the space where certainty had once stood. Her fingers loosened around the sunglasses completely, and they hung at her side, forgotten, as her gaze remained fixed on the path the car had taken, not chasing it, not trying to hold it, just acknowledging it. The street returned to its normal rhythm, cars passing, voices carrying in the distance, the small details of everyday life filling in the space that had been held by tension. But something quieter remained beneath it, something that did not leave with the sound of the engine or the movement of the car. Marcus drove forward, the city opening around him, sunlight shifting across the dashboard, and his expression remained the same, calm, grounded, untouched by the need to prove anything further, because nothing more needed to be proven. Behind him, Victoria turned slowly, her movement unhurried, and looked once more at the reflection in the glass. But this time it showed only her, no distortion, no overlay, just a clear image, and she held that gaze for a moment longer than before, as if seeing something she had overlooked, something that had always been there but never examined. The wind moved lightly across the street, lifting a corner of her jacket, brushing against her in a way that felt almost grounding, and she took a slow breath, deeper than the ones before, the kind that settles rather than fills. The officers were gone. The crowd had disappeared. The car was already turning at the end of the block, its presence fading into the flow of the city, but the silence that followed was not empty. It carried weight, not heavy, but real, like something that would remain long after the moment itself had passed. And in that quiet, standing between the glass and the open street, Victoria did not speak, did not move. She simply stood, listening to something she had not heard before, something that did not come from outside, but from within, steady, undeniable, and finally clear.